Hello, everyone. Let's wait a little bit until people are coming in. Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for people to come in. Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Whitehead Institute's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Speaker Series. This is the first seminar in the series, and the series will be ongoing during the year. These seminars will feature speakers addressing different topics relevant to the Institute's DEI efforts. The goal of the seminars is to foster learning, understanding, and action to create a more diverse and inclusive environment at Whitehead Institute and to make all of us more aware of the issues. This afternoon's session will explore the history and significance of Juneteenth through the lens of one family. As many of you know, Juneteenth commemorates the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States on June 19, 1865. In 2020, the state of Massachusetts added June 19th to the list of annual state holidays. In adding this holiday, Governor Baker said that he hopes this would help recognize the continued need to ensure racial freedom and equity. This year, Juneteenth was recognized as a federal holiday, and in signing the legislation, President Biden said, all Americans can feel the power of this day and learn from our history. This was also the first year this holiday was commemorated at the Whitehead Institute and at MIT. I look forward to learning more through our speaker today, who will tell us the whole truth of her family's history. Our speaker today is Dr. Betty Pierce. Dr. Pierce practiced pediatrics in Boston for 31 years before retiring in 2014 and moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 2018. She is also her family's oral historian and the author of the award-winning memoir, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. Her book won the 2020 International Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society Book Award for Best Nonfiction Autobiography and the 2020 National Association of Black Journalists Book Award. Her writing has appeared in Time, Mental Floss, the Boston Herald, River Teeth, and The Black Lives Have Always Mattered, and was listed as notable in the Best American Essays. She earned her PhD in biology from New York University and an MD from Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Pierce talk is entitled, Always Remember, You Are a Madison, One Family's Juneteenth Story. Really look forward to her talk, but we will also have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So please type in your question using the question and answer feature, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Remember to use the question answer feature and not the chat feature. And now I want to welcome Dr. Pierce very much to the Whitehead Institute, although only the virtual Whitehead Institute, and you have all of our attention. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ruth. It is a pleasure to meet the Whitehead community. My name is Betty Kears, and in the next 40-ish minutes, I'm going to tell you a little of the history of my family, the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and Juneteenth, all through the lens of an African-American descendant of a slave-holding president. The title of my talk is Always Remember, You're a Madison, One Family's Juneteenth Story. President Madison did not have any children with his wife, Dolly, so many scholars believe he was either impotent, infertile, or both. But the oral history of my family says that James Madison Jr., a founding father of our nation, was also a founding father of my African-American family. For more than 200 years, our family credo, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president, has been a source of inspiration and pride, but it started as a mere tool. This slide shows 13 generations of my family. The story of my ancestors in America goes back to 1653, when President Madison's great-great-grandfather, John Madison, and it was spelled with 2 Ds back then, left England to take advantage of the headright system in America. He received 50 acres for himself and each of the 11 indentured servants he brought with him. He turned his 600 acres in the Tidewater area of Virginia into a tobacco farm. But tobacco quickly depletes the soil. So when his grandsons wanted to purchase land, they had to look elsewhere. One of his grandsons, Ambrose, chose the Piedmont region and arrived there with his wife, a son, and 2 daughters in the spring of 1732. But 2 months later, Ambrose was dead, poisoned by 3 enslaved people, 2 of whom were enslaved by Ambrose himself. This was the first documented murder in Virginia of an enslaver by his own enslaved people. My family's first African ancestor in America was my 5 greats grandmother, a stolen woman called Mandy. The oral history that Mandy passed down was that she was stolen from the shore near her village in Ghana, carried across the ocean in the bowels of a wretched ship, shoved onto an auction block, sold, put to work on a small cotton field in a remote corner of a big tobacco plantation, and then raped by her enslaver, James Madison Sr. A baby girl was born through those forced encounters. Mandy named her Corinne. The date of Corinne's birth is unknown, but it is known that on March 16th, 1751, James Sr.'s wife, Nellie, gave birth to a son. The illustrious couple named the first of their 12 children James Jr. Thus, the child born through rape, destined to live enslaved and trapped in slavery, and the child born of marriage, destined to become the fourth president of a new nation, were half siblings. According to the history told by 8 generations of my family's oral historians, Madison became attracted to his half-sister. And around 1794, that attraction led to the birth of a son. Corinne named him Jim. Jim was my great-great-great-grandfather. Shortly after the end of the War of 1812, Madison's wife, Dolly, having learned that Jim and one of her nieces were in love, sold Jim. His father stood by and watched. As Jim was being taken away, Corinne pleaded with him, "Always remember, you're a Madison." She believed the name could help them find each other someday. But Jim's new enslaver took him to Tennessee, and he never saw his mother again. Yet, Jim remembered his mother's words and passed them on to his children and told them to tell their children they were Madisons. Jim probably died in Tennessee, but one of his sons, Emmanuel, who was the president's grandson and my great-great-grandfather, ended up in Texas, initially the property of a man named Jephthah Billingsley. Jephthah's son, Jesse, had moved to Tennessee, from Tennessee to the territory of Texas in 1834, where he commanded the first company to meet the Mexican forces at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836. Revenging the death of his hero, Davy Crockett, Jesse coined the famous battle cry, "Remember the Alamo." For his military leadership, Jesse was ordered some 2,200 acres in Bastrop County. Texas became the 28th state in 1845, admitted to the Union as a slave state, and throngs of settlers, many bringing their enslaved people, surged in, primarily to grow cotton. In 1848, Jesse decided to give some of his land to his father, and Jephthah assigned 2 men to transport Emmanuel, along with his wife Elizabeth and their then 5 sons, from Gibson County, Tennessee, to the town of Cedar Creek in Bastrop County, Texas. It happened without warning. One morning, Elizabeth, Emmanuel, and their sons were about to start out for the cotton field when a white man they had never seen before burst through their cabin door. "Y'all heading out," he announced. "Mr. Jephthah sent me to drive you to Texas. So hurry up and no back talk. Afraid they would be separated and with no time to gather supplies, food, or clothing, the family ran to the open wagon and jumped on board. The driver and a man carrying a shotgun put chains around everyone's ankles, as well as ropes around Emmanuel's wrist. The 800-mile journey seemed endless, and throughout it, the guard held the family at gunpoint to prevent them from trying to escape. When the family finally reached Cedar Creek, they were starving, dehydrated, and too weak to walk. Blood oozed from Manuel's wrist, and the boys sat listlessly on the cabin floor, insects crawling through their hair. Jephthah may have done a good deed keeping the family together, but it was to his advantage to own 6 healthy males and a fertile female who were at home in a cotton field. In spite of their condition, Elizabeth felt blessed her family was alive and together. She would marvel at her good fortune for the rest of her life. Elizabeth said over and over, God is good. God is amazing. In this photograph, taken around 1910, my great-great-grandmother Elizabeth's hands are empty, and she is alone without her husband Emmanuel or their many children. In my childhood, I loved this picture, imagining myself climbing onto her lap and placing my hands in hers. As an adult, I see the gentle strength in hands that picked cotton, created a home, and nurtured some 13 children. When Elizabeth sat for her photograph, she was leaving a gift, an image of resolution, love, and faith in God. I carry this picture with me at all times. In 1857, Jephthah Billingsley transferred ownership of my enslaved ancestors to his son Jesse. Jesse was eccentric, a character straight from the legendary Wild West. He was renowned not only for having been a captain during the Battle of San Jacinto, but for being an Injun fighter, spelled I-N-J-U-N, who wore a buckskin suit taken from the body of a Native American he had killed. And he claimed he clothed his troops in the skins of wild animals and fed a company of 80 men on the Texas frontier with wild game. And while serving in the Congress of the Republic of Texas, he slept at night on the floor of the state capitol building. When he died, the Billingsley family found out that Jesse wanted to be buried with his horse Gopher and his talking Mexican parrot in the front yard of his house. Jesse's family complied. This is a copy of the 1860 slave census, the last taken before the Emancipation Proclamation. The writing on the left is the original writing. That on the right is my mother's. Listed under Jesse's name, here spelled with a Y, are the genders and approximate ages of Emmanuel and Elizabeth and their growing family. My mother took it upon herself to write in our family's names and their years of birth. She made her point. Our ancestors were not items. Despite bondage, Elizabeth and Emmanuel instilled in their children a sense of pride, and they were never allowed to forget their great-grandmother's, Corinne's plea to remember their family name. They were Madisons, and they were together. Still, the threat of being sold and separated hung over them. In March 1861, Abraham Lincoln became president, but just 1 month later, Northerners and Southerners were embroiled in a war that would last more than 4 years, take the lives of more than 700,000 Americans, and free more than 4 million people from bondage. What began as a dispute over the expansion of slavery into the Western territories finished in a bloody face-to-face battle to end slavery throughout the nation. Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas comprised slavery's last stronghold. Slave owners from the Deep South tried to hide their most valuable property, people in bondage, from the Union Army. During the last 2 years of the war, more than 180,000 enslaved people from the Deep South were herded into the geographically isolated areas of Texas for safekeeping. By the end of the war, there were an estimated 250,000 enslaved people in the state. Initially, the Emancipation Proclamation issued on January 1st, 1863, only freed slaves in the 10 Confederate states still in revolt, which included Texas. It did not include people enslaved in the Western territories, the border states, or the Union. Lincoln's intent with the proclamation was to cripple the Confederacy's use of slaves to support its war efforts. But he had no jurisdiction within the Confederacy. So the fighting continued, and the proclamation did not free a single slave. But it did shift the focus of the war from preserving the Union to freeing the slaves. And one of the proclamation's ultimate powers grew out of its provision that Black men could serve in the Union Army and Navy, a change of policy that contributed significantly to the North's eventual victory. Nearly 200,000 Black soldiers in the segregated United States colored troops fought in approximately 200 battles. Another 130,000 enslaved men and women supported the Union forces as laborers, construction workers, cooks, nurses, and caretakers of horses and mules. Enslaved people were not mere spectators. They helped free themselves. Slaves throughout the South, including Emanuel and his family, knew about Lincoln's proclamation, but it could not be enforced. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in Appomattox, Virginia. But Texas was remote, and slaveholders and the state and local governments continued to deny freedom to the enslaved people living there. It wasn't until the morning of Monday, June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger and some 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston, that emancipation was finally enforced in Texas. Granger's men then rode throughout Texas, reading General Order Number 3, which informed all Texans that the slaves were free. By then, Emanuel and Elizabeth had 8 grown-up sons. When they heard the announcement, they whooped and hollered for hours with almost everyone else around. Throughout the South, freed slaves sang and danced. They plucked banjos and shook tambourines. From the tip of Florida to the westernmost edge of Texas, to the nation's capital, celebrations erupted like firecrackers and just as loud. This was the first Jubilee Day, or later, Juneteenth. But Emanuel was quiet. He smiled at Elizabeth, then led her hand in hand to a tree standing on the far edge of the cotton field. He sat down beneath it, then gently pulled her down beside her. His voice tremulous with love, joy, and hope, he said, "I've always loved you. I've always loved our boys. But now I can let myself love you and then them even more. Nobody can take you away from me. Nobody can take our boys away from us. We're free to love each other as much as we want to. Only God is our master now." For the first time, the threat of being sold and separated was gone. The Madison family credo became a reminder that 5 generations of enslavement had not destroyed them. They could take the Billingsley name, but Jim's promise to Corrine had instilled in them who they were. For them, Madison meant family, and they were proud the name had belonged to a president. And now they could claim the name officially. Having dreamed of freedom throughout their lives, the Madisons, like nearly other enslaved family, thought emancipation would make everything better for them. What they soon learned was that the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and even The new amendments, written specifically on their behalf, betrayed them. This political cartoon, published in Harper's Weekly in 1874, illustrates that the organized violence of the Ku Klux Klan and the White League made life worse than slavery for Southern Blacks. Southern whites, angered and terrified by the outcome of the war, did whatever they could to turn the promises of emancipation into uncertainty, tribulation, and terror. Reconstruction was a massive failure, and the Black codes, laws that restricted the lives and livelihoods of former slaves, were oppressive. And the 14th and 15th Amendments, aiming to guarantee civil rights and the right of freedmen to vote, were unenforceable. Black people, though no longer enslaved, were not, in fact, free. Nevertheless, the Madison sought ways to make the most of freedom. Emmanuel told his sons, "We've come far, but we've far to go." He said, "Your great-grandfather was president of this country, so live up to it now that you have the chance. Tell your children and tell them to tell their children. Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from a president." The family credo was now a source of inspiration, and the work of living up to it began. Within the first 10 to 15 years after emancipation, Emmanuel's sons became businessmen, ministers, carpenters, civic leaders, policemen, activists, and landowners. My great uncle Henry bought a horse and wagon to haul logs back and forth from Cedar Creek to build a cabin in Austin, 25 miles away. When the cabin was finished, Henry brought his family home. Within a few years, he was both an alderman and a policeman in the state's capital. More than 100 years later, when a wrecking crew demolished an 1886 frame house in Austin, they discovered an intact, rough-hewn cedar cabin standing in the middle of the rubble. City records revealed that the log cabin built around 1865 on the location was registered as the homestead of Henry G. Madison. Henry had not destroyed the first home he could call his own. The city moved the cabin to Rosewood Park, a recreation center in one of Austin's Black neighborhoods, where it stands today, both a state historical landmark and a monument to the substantial roles slaves and ex-slaves played in American history before and after the first Juneteenth. 30 years later, in 1998, I flew to Austin to see the site I had heard so much about since childhood, my great uncle Henry's cabin. The early day sun was low when I parked the car and climbed the hill. At first, I could not see the cabin, but just knew I was headed in the right direction. As I reached the crest of the hill, the sun glinted through a sparse grove. Then I saw it. The cabin was tiny. Pacing the structure, I measured out approximately 12 square feet, astounded that a family of 2 adults and 7 children, 6 of whom entered the world in that cabin, had lived in such a small space for 21 years. I walked around the cabin, touching and stroking the logs Henry had cut, the coarse mortar he had mixed, and the thick nails he had pounded to build a home for his family. I felt his strength and determination against my hands. That power had not diminished over the decades. It was right there under my fingertips. Henry's brother, Mac, my great-grandfather, had a plan for his freedom too. He wanted to remain near his aging parents, and Cedar Creek, he decided, was not a bad place to live. Another reason Mac stayed was that he had become Jesse Billingsley's right-hand man. Mac took cotton to the gin, negotiated deals, and even handled the money. My mother used to say, imagine that, a Black man allowed to touch a white man's money. Mac and his brother Giles were tenant farmers, halvers, meaning they had to give half of their income from the farm to Billingsley. Still, little by little, they put money away. Giles opened a successful barbershop, and by 1874, Mac had $192 in gold, enough to buy a 96-acre farm. For the first time in his life, Mac owned something, and not just anything. He owned land. Security, survival, and true independence were within reach. Once the deed was in his hands, he left Billingsley. The very next year, Mac sold his farm for $392 to buy 400 acres. Mac's son, John Chester, my beloved Gramps, who was born free, was proud of descending from a president. But he was even more proud that his father, grandfather, and other enslaved ancestors had overcome enslavement. Gramps wanted his 2 sons and 1 daughter, my mother, to know that enslaved people were remarkable individuals who possessed inner strength and a sense of hope by which they survived, and many talents by which they contributed tremendously to America. Gramps added 2 important words to the credo. He told his children and told them to tell their children, always remember, You're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. One of the longest running African American holidays, Jubilee Day, has been called Emancipation Day, America's Second Independence Day, Black Independence Day, and Juneteenth. By the 1890s, it was called Juneteenth most often. Commemorative celebrations date back to 1866, when Black Texans in Galveston dressed to the nines and paraded through the city. I love this picture. These people are just proud and grand. And the woman on the left, with her fancy dress and her fancy hat that she tilts to a sassy angle, just bring joy to me. And the strength and determination in her face remind me of my great uncle Henry's strength and determination when he built a home for his family. In the following years, annual commemorations, which soon included pilgrimages to Galveston, reenacting the history, publicly reading the Emancipation Proclamation, singing gospel songs of the National Negro Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, drinking strawberry soda, and eating barbecue spread throughout the South. During the first 6 decades of the 20th century, the migration of nearly 6 million African Americans from the South to the North and West carried the tradition to all parts of the nation. On January 1st, 1980, Texas became the first state to designate Juneteenth a holiday. Gradually, most states began to recognize it either in a ceremonial observance or as an official holiday. Though Massachusetts was a little late to the party in 2020, the Juneteenth flag, designed by activist Ben Haith, was first hoisted in Boston at the Roxbury Heritage State Park. In this simple but elegant flag, the Star of Texas, the Lone Star State, shines bright, and its light bursts throughout the nation with a new freedom and a new beginning for African Americans over a new horizon. The red, white, and blue remind us all that enslaved people and their descendants were and are Americans. And because African Americans today are still fighting for equality and justice, those colors symbolize the need for a continuous commitment by the people of the United States to live up to the American ideal of liberty and justice for all. These messages are illustrated in the following clip from the documentary film based on my book. You will hear the terms griots and griots. They are men and women who follow the West African tradition of oral history, which dates back thousands of years. As I mentioned before, enslaved people were remarkable human beings who had inner strength and sense of balance and a sense of hope, and they had many talents, and they contributed mightily to this country. But I think it's important for us to remember today that when slaves died, they didn't take those qualities to the grave with them.
Oh, freedom. Whoa, freedom.
They passed them on to their descendants, including those of us alive today. So including me, including my daughter, Nicole, including my 2 grandchildren,
Justice!
one of whom is named Madison.
We don't get it!
Shut it down!
If you don't get it!
Shut it!
And so it'd be 10 generations for Madison and Peter. But those qualities are still with them. And those qualities are still with other African Americans and the generations to come, as long as we remember our enslaved ancestors. And really, that's why the griot tradition is so important.
Hold on.
As I mentioned before, in 2016, then 90-year-old Opal Lee, dubbed Grandmother Juneteenth, marched almost 1,400 miles from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C. to advocate for making Juneteenth a federal holiday. Opal was victorious. On June 15th, 2021, the United States Senate unanimously passed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, followed on June 16th by a 415-14 vote in the House of Representatives, and on June 17th by President Biden's signature. Opal, dressed to the nines, was there, standing joyfully among the other dignitaries. Corinne's words were vital to my family, both in a time when we were listed among someone's property, and in later times when we could take a name and then make a name for ourselves. For our freed ancestors, the admonition was an inspiration for pride and achievement for themselves and the generations to come. And throughout the last 100 years, the credo, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president, has reminded us that we aren't just descendants of a president, we're descendants of enslaved people too. Though we enjoy celebrating them on Juneteenth, we try to honor our enslaved ancestors in how we live our lives every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really informative. I don't know where to begin to ask you questions. The first, maybe just going back to just what you were just talking about, the role of the griot. Why is oral history so important? What does it provide that written history doesn't?
Oral history, I feel, is important to all families because it really tells you who your ancestors were. It tells you about their values and beliefs, and, as well as, their personalities and goals and ambitions. And it kind of tells you who you are, how you got to be who you are. And it is especially important for African American families because very often that is all we have that tells us the legacies our ancestors left for us.
Please, if you have questions, put them into the question and answer box, but I have quite a few, so I will go ahead here. And so another question I had, because at the end you really you went well into the different names for Juneteenth. So do you think we should stick with Juneteenth, or is that, because there were all these other names, and so is this, because to make it similar to July 4th, which is the other holiday which has a date as a name, is that?
Well, I think Juneteenth is fine. I kind of like the original, which was Jubilee Day.
Jubilee.
Yes, which marks the jubilation of the enslaved people in Texas when they learned that they were finally free.
So in your last graph, you actually showed how the tradition of the jury was passed on, and that it already has gone to the next person. How is that person chosen?
Oh, well, yeah. In Africa, it's often within families that the young people are trained by the elders, and it usually stays within the family. In my family, there's not so much of a training as a passing on of a box of family memorabilia from the griot of one generation to the griot or griot in the next generation. And the present griot or griot chooses the next person. Now, in my case, my mother chose me because I was the oldest for one, and for another, and that's kind of a long story. But anyway, my mother chose me, and then I only have one child. So my daughter, Nicole, automatically becomes the griot, or the griot, because the griot is the female form, the female term for the female. But my daughter has two children, a son and a daughter. So she will just choose one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's so. Choosing the name Madison at the time that when it was chosen, it must have gotten some reactions from the white Madison family. So how does that work out? Or is there no communication?
Well, today there is. I've been going back and forth to Montpelier, which was James Madison, or which is James Madison's former plantation in Virginia, since 1992. I've been going back and forth since 1992. And over the years, I have met some members of the recognized Madison family. And some of them have been very welcoming and call me cousin. But others are not particularly happy for me to share my family oral tradition.
Mm-hmm. So how important do you think is the DNA evidence?
Well, for me, personally, it's not that important to prove it with DNA. What is important to me is the stories that I've grown up with and that have inspired my family, and the learning more and more about my enslaved ancestors and the incredible strength that they have has just meant much more than scientific evidence. Because the name has been important for all those generations.
Yeah, and at the end, it's kind of, it in a way it manifests the connection that was there because they were enslaved, and there was a connection with the family, right? And that those families are carrying that connection on both sides. I think that's what I thought was a really interesting point that you're making, irrespective, because those families enslaved those people, right? So I thought that was, I think it's a really important point. Have you learned anything from your trip to Montpellier that was different from what your mother told you? Or
well,
you're a historian. And
yeah, I mean, the staff at Montpelier has always, since 1992, been very helpful. They have helped in every way they could. So I've gotten closer looks into the private lives of James and Dolly Madison, figuring out what kind of people they were. And I had two incredible experiences at Montpelier that my mother did not have. And one of those was walking in the footsteps of Corinne. And Corinne was a cook. And when I first went there in 1992, when I went to Montpelier in 1992, they had just begun excavating the South Kitchen, which is about 70 feet away from the back of the mansion. And there was a groove in the ground that led from the kitchen to the back of the mansion. And the archaeologist at that time, her name was Lynn Lewis, explained to me that groove had been worn into the ground by generations of enslaved cooks walking to and from the mansion. So I was able to step into that groove and follow the length of it from the kitchen to the mansion, which meant I was walking literally in Corinne's footsteps.
Amazing.
And the other experience that I had that my mother didn't have, because they hadn't yet, when my mother went, they hadn't yet found the slave cemetery. I went there again with Lynn Lewis, and it really is a kingdom of trees. But when I went there, I was drawn to a particular tree, and enslaved people following the West African tradition would bury their dead at the foot of trees whenever possible. And the enslaved people at Montpelier, and I'm sure other enslaved communities as well, used crude blocks of quartz as headstones and footstones. So I was drawn to this particular tree, and at the base of this tree was this piece of quartz. And I knelt down and touched the quartz and just felt the presence of Mandy, who was Corinne's mother, my family's first, Mandy was my family's first ancestor in America. So those were both really, exceptional experiences.
No, that's really good. I want to thank you so much. It's really, I think, so effective and it's so moving to hear the story from the people who lived this. And I think that is so important. And so you've done a really important job also with writing this wonderful book, which I really enjoy reading.
Oh, thank you.
We purchased actually some copies of Betty's book, and we have placed them in the library, and they are available for anyone to borrow and read. And I just do think that this personalized experience of slavery in America is very important. It was very important for me to read, and I hope many of our listeners will look more closely now at the story that you were telling. It's really a pleasure to have had you here, and I think for all of us, it is one thing to know there was slavery in America, but quite another one to see the experience through someone's eye like you, and especially like this story that you were just telling us, to really go back there and get to the very, very beginning as a historian. So if you have not read the book, I encourage you to read it. And I thank you so much, Betty. It was a real pleasure to get you to know also a little bit and to hear your absolutely amazing story. And thanks everyone for joining.
And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. What a great way to start this series.
Thank you.